Hi. In this session, we'll explore concepts of print and oral language. Both of these concepts essentially important to early literacy development. Let's talk a little bit about some of the important aspects of concepts of print. One thing to note is that it does not develop naturally. It actually has to be taught. Now, for most kids, this will happen from reading naturally. But for other kids, it'll have to be pointed out directly. Some of the kinds of things that kids will learn when they study concepts about print will be that, for example, when they see a word, that word represents a picture. So, for example, when they see the word car, that word represents that picture. Okay. They'll also learn something called partiality. Now, what this means is that sometimes they might read a whole section of text, or a whole section of text might be read to them, but it might only show one small part in the picture. Kids will also have to learn relevance, right? That pictures and words kind of go together, sometimes extending your storyline or your learning, sometimes just clarifying it. They'll learn permeance, which means that no matter how many times I read this text, I'll read it the exact same way. Now, as you kind of get into the books, you'll start to teach kids that they all need to learn to read from front to back. You'll teach them that they're going to read from left to right, from top to bottom. This way of organizing print might seem logical to many of you at first, but depending on what your home language is, depending on how often you've been read to, these things might not be as natural as you might think. You'll also learn to do something called one-to-one correspondence. So as kids learn print concepts, they learn to put their finger underneath the word to follow along in the text. These are the kinds of things that kids will learn when you're trying to teach the mastery of concepts of print skills. So we have to think very carefully about expanding children's vocabularies. One of the ways that we can do that work is simply through conversation, through back and forth conversation. In the classroom, you can do things like change your questioning techniques from being just yes and no questions to actually asking open-ended questions that push students to do some explaining. Okay, so let me give you an example of one of those. You could ask, you know, are you reading a book? To which the child could answer yes or no. But a better question would be, what are you doing? This forces some explanation out of the child. You could ask, what color is the Play-Doh? But instead, you might want to try saying, what are you doing with the Play-Doh? This kind of open-ended question leads kids to talk more. The other kinds of things you can do, making sure that when you teach new words that you're teaching them in categories or groups. So for example, if you're going to teach the names of fruits, you want to teach multiple fruits at the same time. If you're going to teach the names of colors, you'll want to teach multiple color words kind of simultaneously. Also important to learning new words is the idea of knowledge building. So when we think about knowledge building, we think about things such as read aloud books, things like field trips, things like science and social studies. There are a lot of people who think that if we don't teach science and social studies to kids until they're much older, that there'll be no adverse effects, when in fact, there are many adverse effects, including, but not limited to, a stifled vocabulary, which can impact overall reading. And the last thing I want to talk about when thinking about learning new words is this idea of translanguaging. So what that is especially um, noted for is when you have a student who's, say, learning both Spanish and English, and they start to mix the two languages, saying something like parqueando for parking, this ando being like the verb in Spanish, and park from English. Now, one of the things that you can do to encourage kids who speak multiple languages, you can look for text that actually have some vocabulary or some words in another language, encouraging kids to kind of mix the two languages that they know. This is also under that big umbrella of translanguaging. Now, when we're thinking about expanding vocabularies, another concept that is particularly helpful is called adding on. So maybe the child says, the baby is eating, and then you respond with something like, the baby's eating healthy food that will one day make it a stronger person. Okay, so you see how you're kind of like adding on to the language. Some really practical things that you can do to get kids talking is encourage them to talk about why and how things work, maybe join in a pretend play center, maybe asking questions or pretending to be, say, the doctor or the animal caregiver. And you can get kids to talk a little bit about things that happened in the past or things that happen in the future. That's called decontextualizing. All of these kinds of things are really going to help with the vocabulary development, which in turn will help with their reading development. Now, the other important part of reading development is, of course, reading out loud, right? The language of text is very different from the language that we speak. The language in text contains rare words. It contains complex sentences, much more so than if we're just reading out loud. So to display this, I'm going to show you a page from Where the Wild Things Are. Okay. Just from this one page. And when he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth. Okay, and you can see the number of vocabulary words and complex verbs that they gained from this sentence passage that they wouldn't have gotten from everyday conversation. And so, likewise, a lot of book language can be like that, and it can really lift the level of conversation for kids. It can also open kids into different cultures, linguistic backgrounds, genres, and this can be a place where we can really build up language. And the final thing that I would like to talk about are what are called Elizabeth Selsby books, sometimes called emergent storybook reading. Okay. These books are books that carry a clear narrative text structure, books that often have refrains or interesting parts in them. One of my favorite Elizabeth Selsby books is The Billy Goat's Gruff, right? Where you have the bridge and you have a clear setting and you have a clear conflict and you have like these interesting characters. Okay. So the first thing you do is you kind of think about what are these books that I might use with my students. If you do this work, what you do is you read these books to students again and again until the bones, until the books actually start to kind of like get in their bones. Okay. And once you've done that, then you can use what's called an Elizabeth Selsby or an emergent storybook scale. And you can judge students' sense of narrative structure and how books work. And you can judge their oral language. And you can judge how they self regulate or self correct as they read. And all of these pieces of reading really go into reading comprehension when students get older. And part of Elizabeth Selsby's work is showing that correlation between this work at a young age and reading comprehension as students get older. I want you to think about not only the importance of oral language to learning to read, but the importance of teaching kids how to speak and how to read the language of books.